the land of Eldorion. In the heart of a vast and ancient land, where the mountains rose like silent sentinels, and the rivers sang with the voices of the wind, there lay the realm of Eldorion. This was a place where the trees whispered secrets to the stars, and the rivers carried the dreams of the past. The forests of Eldorion stretched endlessly, their canopies thick with emerald leaves that shimmered beneath the pale light of the moon. The air was rich with the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustle of unseen creatures that moved through the undergrowth. Here, the land was not merely a place to be ruled, but a living entity, a force that had existed long before the first man had set foot upon its soil. At the heart of this land stood the Elven King, a ruler not of conquest, but of wisdom and harmony. His people, the elves of Eldorion, were not bound by the ambitions of men, nor did they seek to dominate the land. Instead, they lived in balance with it, tending to its needs as one might tend to the growth of a sacred grove. The Elven King, with his silver hair and eyes that gleamed like the dawn, was both guardian and guide, ensuring that the land remained unspoiled and that the ancient ways were never forgotten. He spoke with the trees, listened to the rivers, and walked among the stars, for he was not merely a king. He was a part of the land itself. Yet, even in this place of peace and wonder, there was a growing unease. The winds that once carried thy songs of the forest now carried whispers of change, and the rivers, once clear and pure, had begun to murmur of things unseen. The Elven King, though wise beyond measure, could not ignore the signs that the land was shifting, as if the very earth was preparing for a reckoning. And in the shadows of the great trees, where the roots of the world ran deep, a quiet tension had begun to stir. The harmony that had long defined Eldorion was beginning to waver, and the balance between man and nature was on the verge of being broken. The Woodcutter of Eldorion. Among the many who called Eldorion their home, there was one whose footsteps were as familiar to the forest as the wind itself. Elenor, a woodcutter of quiet strength and unshakable devotion, had spent her life tending to the land, not as a master, but as a servant of its will. She rose before the first light of dawn, her hands calloused from years of labor, and walked the winding paths of the ancient forest with the ease of someone who had known it since childhood. To her, the trees were not mere timber to be felled, but living beings, each with its own story, its own wisdom. She listened to the rustling of leaves, the murmuring of the rivers, and the distant songs of birds that wove through the canopy like threads of an unseen tapestry. Eleanor's connection to the forest was not born of duty alone, but of love. She had been raised among the trees, her earliest memories filled with the scent of moss and the warmth of the sun filtering through the leaves. Her father, a woodcutter before her, had taught her the ways of the land, and she had learned to respect its gifts with reverence. She did not cut with haste, nor did she take more than was needed. Every tree she felled was done with care, and every branch she gathered was used with purpose. The forest had given her life, and in return she gave it her devotion. Yet even as she worked, she could not ignore the changes that had begun to take root. The trees, once so full of life, now stood with a quiet unease, their leaves trembling as if in fear. The rivers, which had once flowed with a steady and unbroken song, had begun to murmur of things unseen. The animals, too, had grown restless, their calls more distant, their movements more cautious. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that had yet to come. Elenor had always believed that the balance between man and nature was sacred, a harmony that must never be broken. But now she could not shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the forest was no longer content with the way things were. The Elven King had spoken of great changes, though he had not yet revealed their nature. And though she did not yet know the full truth, she felt it in the very air, in the way the wind carried whispers of something coming, something that would test the strength of her faith in the land she had always called home. The Elven King's Ascent. The Elven King's Ascent. The Elven King, once a guardian of balance and a voice of wisdom, had begun to change. His once gleaming eyes, which had mirrored the stars and held the secrets of the forest, now burned with a different kind of light, one that spoke not of harmony, but of ambition. The whispers of the wind, once a source of guidance, had grown faint, and the rivers, which had once sung songs of peace, now carried the weight of a growing unease. The Elven King had long been a part of the land, but now he seemed to be moving away from it, his thoughts turning inward, his gaze fixed on a vision that no longer aligned with the ancient ways. At first the changes were subtle. The Elven King spoke less of the forest and more of the possibilities that lay beyond it. He spoke of power, of the need to expand. Eldorion's influence, to ensure that the land was not merely protected but also shaped by the will of its rulers. He no longer walked the paths of the forest with the same reverence, nor did he listen to the songs of the trees with the same patience. Instead, he sought counsel from those who had long been absent from the realm, those who had once ruled with steel and fire, who had built their empires upon the bones of the earth. He listened to their words, not with fear, but with a growing hunger for dominion. The council of elders, the wise and ancient beings who had served the Elven King for centuries, watched with growing concern. They had seen the rise and fall of many rulers, had witnessed the slow decay of lands that had once flourished. They knew, but as channels to be redirected. He spoke of a future where Eldorion would no longer be a place of peace and quiet, but a kingdom of power and strength, where the Elven King would not merely rule, but command. And so, the first signs of the land's retaliation began to take shape. The trees, once so full of life, began to wither at the edges, their leaves turning brittle and brown. The rivers, which had once flowed with a steady and unbroken song, began to murmur of things unseen, their waters darkening with the weight of unseen forces. The animals, too, had grown restless, their calls more distant, their movements more cautious. The forest, which had once been a sanctuary of harmony, now trembled with unease. The Elven King, for all his wisdom, had not yet seen the full consequences of his actions. But the land, ancient and unyielding, had begun to whisper its warnings, and the balance that had once defined Eldorion was beginning to break. The forest's lament. The first true sign of the forest's wrath came in the form of a great silence. The trees, once filled with the songs of birds and the rustling of unseen creatures, now stood in eerie stillness. The wind, which had once carried the voices of the forest, now moved with a hush, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural quiet that had settled upon the land. The rivers, once clear and flowing with a steady rhythm, had begun to change, turning dark, their waters thick with an unknown substance that clung to the riverbed like a curse. The fish that had once danced in the currents now lay lifeless upon the banks, their scales dull and their eyes clouded with something that should not have been. The people of Eldorion, those who had lived in harmony with the land for generations, felt the shift before they saw it. The crops that had once flourished in the fields now withered before their time, their roots turning brittle and black. The flowers that had once bloomed in vibrant colors now stood pale and lifeless, their petals falling to the ground like the tears of a forgotten dream. The animals, too, had grown restless, their once familiar calls now distant, their movements hesitant, as if they feared something unseen. Even the stars, which had once shone with a steady light above the land, now seemed dimmer, as if the heavens themselves mourned the changes that had begun to the ground like the tears of a forgotten dream. With its branches broken, its roots exposed, and its leaves falling like the last breath of something that had once been whole. The woodcutter's dilemma. Elenor stood at the edge of the forest, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding with the weight of the decision before her. The land had begun to wither, and the Elven King had grown distant from the harmony that had once defined Eldorion. She had seen the signs, felt the change in the air, in the way the trees no longer sang with the wind, in the way the rivers no longer carried the songs of the past. And yet she could not ignore the words of the Elven King, who had spoken of a future where Eldorion would no longer be a place of peace, but a kingdom of power and strength. She had always believed in the balance between man and nature, in the sacred bond that had existed between the people of Eldorion and the land they called home. But now that bond was fraying, and she could not ignore the growing unease that had taken root in her heart. The trees, once her greatest allies, now stood in silence, their leaves trembling as if in fear. The rivers, once clear and pure, had turned dark with an unseen force. The animals, which had once trusted her, now moved with caution, their eyes filled with something she could not name. She had tried to speak to the Elven King, to warn him of the changes that were taking place, of the signs that the land was not yielding to his will. But he had not listened. His eyes had been filled with a determination that had not been there before, a hunger for power that she had never seen in him before. He had spoken of the need to shape the land, to bend it to the will of Eldorion, to ensure that the future was not dictated by the past, but by the strength of those who ruled it. The Council of Elders had tried to intervene, their voices filled with the weight of history, their warnings heavy with the knowledge of what had come before. They had spoken of the price of those who had tried to shape the land to their own ends, of the ruins that had been left behind by those who had sought to control what was never meant to be controlled. But the Elven King had not listened. He had turned away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if he could already see the future that he wished to create. And now Elenor stood at the crossroads of her own fate. She had always followed the path of the land, had always listened to the whispers of the trees, had always believed that the balance between man and nature was sacred. But now she could not ignore the truth that had been laid before her. The land was no longer content with the way things were. And if she did not act, if she did not speak against the Elven King's growing ambition, then Eldorion would be lost. She took a deep breath, the wind stirring the leaves around her, and stepped forward. The time for silence was over. She would not stand by. As the land was broken, as the harmony that had once defined Eldorion was shattered, she would speak, even if it meant facing the Elven King himself. The journey to the heart of the forest. Eleanor's journey into the depths of the forest was unlike any she had ever taken. The path she had always known, the one that wound through the ancient trees and led to the heart of Eldorion, was now unfamiliar, as if the land itself had shifted beneath her feet. The once familiar sounds of the forest were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed upon her like a weight. The trees, which had once stood tall and proud, now leaned with a strange, unnatural slant, their branches twisted and broken. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, as though the very breath of the land had been stolen. She moved carefully, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that had gathered in the undergrowth. Every step she took felt like a violation of something sacred, and she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. The wind, which had once carried the songs of the forest, now moved in slow, deliberate motions, as if whispering secrets that had long been forgotten. The river, once a steady and unbroken current, now flowed with a sluggish rhythm, its waters dark and still. At last she reached the ancient grove, a place that had always been a sanctuary, a place where the trees stood in perfect harmony, their roots entwined in an unbroken circle. But now the grove was different. The trees, which had once stood tall, and the trees whispered their voices to the stars. Elenor knew that the land had not been broken beyond repair. It had been given a chance to heal, and perhaps in time it would find its way back to the harmony that had once defined Eldorion. The legacy of balance. In the days that followed the Elven King's revelation, the land of Eldorion began to shift once more, not in the way of destruction, but in the way of renewal. The trees, which had once stood in silent protest, now swayed gently with the wind, their leaves rustling with the songs of the past. The rivers, which had turned dark with the weight of unseen forces, began to flow with a steady rhythm once more, their waters clear and pure, as if the land itself had been cleansed. The animals, which had fled in fear, returned to the forest, their calls echoing through the trees as if in celebration of the balance that had been restored. The Elven King, once a man who had sought to shape the world in his own image, now walked among the trees with a different purpose. He no longer sought to command the land, but to listen to it, to understand the will of the forest, and to walk in harmony with it. He spoke with the trees, listened to the rivers, and allowed the wind to carry his voice across the land. And as he did so, the people of Eldorion followed his lead, no longer seeking to bend the world to their will, but to live in the way that had once defined their people. Elenor, too, found peace in the knowledge that she had done what she could. She had not changed the Elven King's path, but she had reminded him of the truth that had been lost. She had stood before him not as a servant of the land, but as its voice, and in doing so she had ensured that the balance that had once defined Eldorion would not be broken again. She returned to the forest, where she had always belonged, and continued her work with the same reverence that had always guided her hands. She no longer cut with haste, nor did she take more than was needed. She listened to the whispers of the trees, and in their voices she found the wisdom of the land. And so the land of Eldorion endured, not as a place of conquest, nor as a place of ruin, but as a place of harmony. The balance between man and nature had been restored, not through force, but through understanding. The Elven King had learned that true strength did not come from shaping the world to one's own will, but from walking in harmony with it. And in that the legacy of Eldorion endured, a testament to the power of balance, of the wisdom of the past, and of the enduring bond between man and the land that had always been their home. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.